Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. And in this video, I'm not going to talk my usual length from this one because I want to discuss the latest on legal action being taken against the government for the potentially corrupt and, importantly, unlawful spending of billions of pounds of public money on PPE contracts. This particular one focuses on contracts worth about £500 million to three companies who would, on the face of it, and indeed when you look in a bit more detail, appear to be wholly unsuitable companies without the proper processes being followed. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, quick review of what's been happening, because there's an awful lot of cases and there's an awful lot of scrutiny, potentially legal scrutiny, being placed on the government's behaviour with their public spending. Award of public money needs to be transparent. It's not a private arrangement, it's our money. Ordinarily, there should also be a process of competitive tender whereby contracts are advertised, bids are sent in, and a vetting process begins to get the goods or services, depending on what the contract's for, that we need, with value for public money a key criterion. Now, the emergency legislation passed by Boris Johnson's government regarding COVID earlier this year does allow them to give out contracts for COVID measures without competitive tender. So that would include for getting PPE. But it remains to be seen whether or not they can legally use that as an excuse to engage in cronyism or chumocracy, as it's been known right now with these measures. In addition, regardless of the emergency provisions, the government are still legally obliged to publish the details of contracts within 30 days of issue. This is not occurring. So the Good Law Project, talked about them before, will again, in conjunction with others at times, is taking the government to court over a whole mess of things, but in this particular issue, there has been some progress this week. So there was a bit of a win and there was a bit of a loss. Which means that the eventual court case, it looked like the full hearing was going to be next February. It's now going to be later, but it should be before summer, as far as can be told. So that drags the process out for longer, but the decision was based on the fact that although it will do that, potentially more of the awarding of these contracts will be put under scrutiny. You want as much as possible fully examined. Now, these particular cases, as I say, centre around contracts awarded to three companies: Pestfix, Clandeboy and Ayanda. Though it's potentially part of a wider problem as well. It's not just that there's contracts given to these three companies and there's no other dodginess. Remember, official figures last week showed that companies that had links to either the Conservative Party or to individual ministers were 10 times more likely to get these contracts than others. Now, the win this week is that the lawyers will be able to argue that the contracts were irrational to the full hearing next year. In other words, there will be a judicial review of that. That will focus on the so-called VIP lane, which, like I said, is the process by which lucrative contracts were given to those with personal connections to the party or ministers, 10 times as likely to be successful. The main issue with these particular companies can be readily put like this. So you've got £108 million worth of contracts given to a pest control firm with a value of £18,000. Net assets of £18,000. Another £108 million of contracts given to a company that sells sugar and chocolate. It was not noted at the time as... At the time this sort of came out, people were sort of saying it's a little bit odd, isn't it? You've got two contracts for 108 million to two different companies for different things, PPE, but for different things. A little bit odd that it's exactly the same amount of money. And then the final company was it seems to be a private fund agency operating out of a tax haven. It's not entirely clear to people investigating it exactly what it does. They were given £252 million. So nearly £500 million given to companies that don't produce PPE or any medical equipment, and they don't sell medical equipment either. That their business is something else. They're not a medical company of any description. Now, I get that when you need to issue contracts quickly, you may not get the decisions quite right. But if I was a hard-pressed health secretary, needed to do this quickly. And let's remember where we came from here. The government were advised to stock up on certain PPE last year before we even knew this was coming. They refused to do so, wanted to cut a few corners, save a few quid. So our stocks were low on quite a lot of things that they should not have been. Then when it came to February, when we knew this was coming, they were advised to stock up on other things as well. Investigative reporters discovered documentation that proved the government still refused at that point. So the fact that we had to act quickly, partly, yes, we would have had to do that to a certain extent because of the extra demand, but our stocks were lower than they should have been. So that's why we're in this position. But we were in the position we were in. It was still Boris Johnson's fault. It was still Matt Hancock's fault. But we were in that position. Now, if I were that hard-pressed health secretary that wanted to get this done quickly, of course, I would need to make a rush, and I may not get it quite right, but I would approach companies that either make PPE or at least ones whose business model is procuring it and selling it, at the very least. But anyway, that is the situation. There is a side issue as well, which is another court case, is that not all of the equipment was as ordered, and there was a very serious case in one case, at least, of the equipment being provided not actually passing the safety checks. The safety checks were falsified effectively. But that's another issue. I have already talked about that, I think. But anyway, on to the preliminary hearings. And the loss this week did involve a judge not deeming it appropriate to investigate the fact that the PPE was ordered using these contracts for a 5-year supply. The judge took the view that, well, that's fine, they can do that. There's not even worth having a judicial review over that. Now, the legal group disagrees with this, and so we'll be appealing it, and that is what is going to make this take longer. That is the cause of the delay in the process. Now, I'm going to discuss this one because I'm not a legal expert. Many of the people watching this are not legal experts, but it is one that I think, without being a legal expert, you can still consider, because the law often talks about, what is reasonable. So I'm going to be coming at it from the point of view of what a reasonable person may think. You may agree or disagree. So the way I see it is this: the government are using emergency legislation to award contracts without competitive tender in order to acquire the necessary PPE quickly, because we needed it now. We still need a load now. COVID presented a serious emergency, no doubt about that. The government had refused to stockpile the equipment that it was advised to, even before the emergency, so we were stuck. We needed that PPE to come in very, very quickly. We were behind on this. Now, I could still argue that it didn't actually arrive very quickly for all their use of emergency powers, but let's leave that one for now. I accept that the government needed PPE quickly and so had to issue contracts quickly, possibly without as much thought as would ordinarily be the case. However, the whole world was buying PPE at the time. This created shortages. That in turn drove up the prices. Now, when you look at what we have been spending, it actually seems to be way more than even the inflated new market values. But that is again another issue, but one that needs looking at. But the point is that we were buying PPE at prices that would not normally be considered good value for public money, a key criterion for public procurement. Now, based on this argument alone, okay, we needed the PPE, we needed an emergency, it costs a load more at the moment, we have to pay those prices to get it in use now. Of course, I say. But I would also say that obviously it would not have been sensible to have ordered 5 years worth of PPE at those inflated prices under those conditions. Nobody was imagining the emergency will last for 5 years' time. Nobody was imagining that demand for PPE would sustain at those levels for the next 5 years. We'll hope that the emergency doesn't even last for more than 2 years from the start. Albeit, we'll still expect to be living with the virus in some form after that point, but we'd largely be expected to move on to some sort of normal. So legal views aside, I don't see on what basis a judge would say that the government were definite, because that's what she's saying. She's not saying with these judgments that the government definitely are in the wrong or are in the right. Simply that either there is the government, she's either saying the government are definitely in the right and therefore that's why it's not worth going to the full hearing, or they may be in the wrong and that's why it is worth going. So by saying it's not worth going to the full hearing, she's saying the government have definitely, without any shadow of doubt, acted quite properly in ordering 5 years worth of PPE from companies that don't really supply PPE at massively inflated prices. Yeah, I think the appeal is worth pursuing, and I would be very surprised if it were not successful. But like I said, I'm not a legal expert. Let us say it goes to appeal and a different judge gives the same view. Then that will be that. And it will clearly just be a case that, you know, the law is simply powerless to prevent what is, from a natural justice point of view, clearly an action that is not in the public's interest. But that's the scenario there. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.